I used to believe that being understood could fix anything. If people just knew my intentions, if they could see my heart the way I felt it beating inside my chest, then misunderstandings would dissolve on their own. Love would return to its natural shape. Harmony would follow. That belief carried me for years. Even after Saad got married, I held on to it tightly. At first, nothing felt broken. The house looked the same. The walls still echoed familiar sounds. The kitchen smelled of spices and tea the way it always had. If I focused hard enough, I could pretend that nothing essential had changed. But of course, everything had. Sanaa entered our home gently. She wasn't loud or dismissive. She was respectful, careful with her words, thoughtful in the way she placed her shoes near the door. Everyone praised her manners, her calm nature, her intelligence. I praised her too. I wanted to. I wanted to be the kind of mother-in-law who made things easy. The kind who didn't interfere. The kind who smiled and stepped back at the right moments. I had seen enough stories to know what not to become. So I told myself, if I explain myself clearly, there will be no problems. At first, Saad still came to me the way he always had. He asked my opinion, even if he didn't always follow it. He checked in, even if he didn't stay long. Those small gestures reassured me. I told myself I was still understood. The first crack appeared quietly. It was over something small, so small that, at the time, I almost laughed it off. Sanaa had rearranged the kitchen. Not dramatically. Just a few shelves, a few containers moved around. When I opened a drawer and couldn't find something I needed, I paused, confused. "Oh," Sanaa said gently, noticing my hesitation. I reorganized a little. "I hope that's okay." Her voice was polite. Her smile careful. "Of course," I replied quickly. "You did a good job." And I meant it. Later that evening, Saad mentioned it casually. "Mom, Sanaa was worried you might not like the changes." I smiled again. Why wouldn't I? She's part of this home now. He nodded, but something in his expression felt cautious. That was the first time I noticed it. That look. Like he was weighing my words, checking for hidden meaning. I brushed it aside. They're just adjusting, I told myself. Once they understand me better, it will be fine. I made an effort to explain myself more. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I wanted to avoid misunderstandings before they formed. If I suggested something, I added context. If I asked a question, I softened it with reassurance. If I felt uncomfortable, I smiled through it and explained why. I believed explanation was kindness. But slowly, explanation became interpretation. One afternoon, Saad sat across from me, his phone face down on the table. He looked serious in a way that made my chest tighten. "Sanaa feels like sometimes you don't trust her decisions," he said. The words landed heavier than I expected. "I trust her," I replied immediately. "I only give suggestions because I've lived here longer. I'm not questioning her." He nodded, but again that pause. "She understands that," he said. "But sometimes it comes across as control." Control. The word echoed in my mind long after he left the room. That wasn't what I meant. That wasn't what I felt. That wasn't who I was. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed every conversation in my head, every comment I'd made, every suggestion I'd offered. I searched for sharpness, for judgment, for anything that could be mistaken as control. All I found was concern, care, habit. The next morning, I decided to explain myself clearly. "Sanaa," I said gently while we prepared breakfast together, "I hope you never feel like I'm interfering. If I say something, it's only because I care. Please tell me if I ever cross a line." She smiled. "No, Mom, it's fine. I understand." I exhaled, relieved. She understands, I told myself. But understanding, I would later learn, is not always accurate. Over the next few weeks, I noticed small shifts. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt measured. Laughter arrived late, if at all. I was still included, but differently. When decisions were made, they were often already finalized before reaching me. "We thought it would be easier this way," Saad explained once. I nodded, even though something in my chest tightened. "I just don't want you to feel pressured," Sanaa added. Pressured. Another word that didn't belong to me, but now hovered around my presence. Each time, I explained again. I don't feel pressured, I said. I don't mind, I reassured. I'm happy either way. And they listened. That was the strange part. They listened carefully. They nodded. They responded kindly. But afterward, nothing changed. Instead, I felt myself becoming something else in their eyes, something I didn't recognize. A figure to manage, a presence to soften around, a personality to interpret. One evening, I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. I know she doesn't mean harm, Sana said quietly. She's just emotional. Emotional. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand resting against the wall. Emotional wasn't an insult, but it wasn't the truth either. I wasn't emotional. I was expressive. I was thoughtful. I was used to being involved. But in their understanding, those details blurred into something simpler. Something easier to categorize. I went back to my room without making a sound. That night, something shifted inside me. For the first time, I wondered if being understood was even possible. Because what they understood wasn't me. It was a version of me filtered through their fears, their adjustments, their need for independence. And no matter how clearly I explained myself, that version remained. I realized then that rejection would have been easier. Rejection would have been honest. A clear line. A clear boundary. But misunderstanding was confusing. It made me question myself. It made me wonder if my intentions were flawed, if my love was excessive, if my presence was heavier than I realized. I started speaking less, not out of anger, but out of caution. Each word felt like it needed a disclaimer. Each sentence felt like it could be translated incorrectly. And slowly, the belief I had carried for so long began to crack. Understanding doesn't always heal, I thought. Sometimes it wounds more deeply than rejection ever could. Still, I hadn't given up yet. Part of me believed that if I tried just a little harder, if I explained just a little better, they would finally see me clearly. I didn't know then that this hope would cost me more than silence ever could. There is a special kind of pain that comes from being listened to carefully, attentively, and still being understood wrong. It would have been easier if they had dismissed me outright. Easier if they had interrupted, argued, or walked away. At least then I could have named the distance. But they didn't. They listened. Saad sat across from me, nodding gently. Sana met my eyes, her expression calm, reassuring. Their faces reflected patience, not hostility. And yet, when the conversation ended, I felt smaller than when it began. That was when I realized listening and understanding are not the same thing. I began to notice patterns. Whenever I spoke about the past, about how things used to be, they heard nostalgia but interpreted it as resistance. When I offered a suggestion, they heard advice, but translated it into control. When I stayed quiet, they heard disappointment. No matter what I did, the conclusion felt predetermined. One afternoon, I mentioned casually that Saad used to prefer eating dinner earlier. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even a suggestion. It was just a memory, spoken softly, without expectation. Sana smiled.
"We'll see," she said.
Later that evening, Saad approached me with a careful tone I had come to recognize. "Mom, Sana feels like you're not comfortable with how we do things." I stared at him. "That's not what I said," I replied slowly. "I know," he said quickly. But that's how it felt to her.
Felt.
The word pressed against my chest. I wanted to ask how a feeling could outweigh a fact, but I didn't. Instead, I nodded and said what I had learned to say. "I'm comfortable. Truly." And again, they believed they understood me. But what they understood was an image of me shaped by assumptions. I started to feel like I was being translated into a language I didn't speak. At family gatherings, I watched myself through their eyes. If I laughed too loudly, I was emotional. If I stayed quiet, I was upset. If I asked a question, I was concerned. If I didn't, I was distant. There was no neutral ground. I noticed how Saad began to phrase things differently around me. "We thought this would be best," he'd say, before I even spoke. Or, "I hope you don't mind," even when there was nothing to mind. Each sentence carried a layer of anticipation, like he was preparing for a reaction I hadn't had yet. I wanted to tell him, "You don't have to handle me this way." But how do you explain that without becoming the very thing they think you are? One evening, Sanaa and I were alone in the living room. The television murmured softly in the background, neither of us really watching. "Mom," she said, hesitating, "I hope you know we really respect you." I smiled. "I know," she continued. "Sometimes it's just hard to know what you're feeling." I considered that. "I usually say what I feel," I replied. She nodded. "Yes, but sometimes it feels like there's more underneath." More underneath. I realized then that they weren't reacting to my words, they were reacting to their interpretations of my silence, my tone, my pauses. I was no longer allowed to be simple. Every gesture carried weight. Every sentence invited analysis. I went to my room that night and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the familiar walls. I asked myself a question I had never asked before. What if they never see me the way I see myself? The thought unsettled me. I had lived my life believing that clarity came from honesty, that if you spoke from the heart, people would meet you there. But here I was, honest to exhaustion, and still misunderstood. The more I tried to clarify, the more complicated things became. I explained my intentions, and they questioned my motives. I expressed care, and they sensed pressure. I stepped back, and they sensed hurt. It was like trying to hold water in my hands. One afternoon, I overheard Saad on the phone. "She doesn't say much now," he was telling someone. "I think she's adjusting." Adjusting. The word felt incomplete. I wasn't adjusting. I was retreating. I stopped offering opinions unless asked. I learned to pause before speaking, to weigh each word like it could tip a scale. I smiled more. I nodded more. On the surface, things looked peaceful. Inside, I felt erased. Not because I was excluded, but because I was no longer recognized accurately. I had become a version of myself that made others comfortable. That realization hurt more than I expected. I remembered times in my life when I had been rejected outright. Friends who drifted away. Opportunities that passed me by. Those moments were painful, but clean. This was different. This was slow. This was confusing. This was being told, gently and repeatedly, that who I was didn't match who they believed me to be. One evening, Saad sat beside me after dinner. "Mom," he said softly, "I hope you don't feel pushed aside." I looked at him, at the boy I had raised, now carefully choosing his words like stepping around fragile glass. "I don't feel pushed aside," I said. "I just feel unseen." He frowned slightly. "That's not our intention." "I know," I replied. And I meant it. Intentions weren't the problem. Perception was. That night, as I lay awake, I admitted something to myself that I hadn't been ready to face. Being understood incorrectly was changing me. It was making me quieter, smaller, more cautious. It was making me doubt instincts I had trusted for decades. And I wondered how long I could live like this, constantly explaining, constantly adjusting, constantly being translated into something I wasn't. I had believed understanding would bring peace. But now I was beginning to see the truth. Sometimes, misunderstanding doesn't come from not listening. It comes from seeing someone through the wrong lens and refusing to change it. And that, I realized, hurts far more than rejection ever could. There are wounds you can name. Rejection is one of them. It comes with clarity. A sharp edge. A moment where you know exactly where you stand. Someone says no. Someone chooses another path. Someone steps away. It hurts, but it ends the confusion. What I was living through had no such ending. It lingered. It sat quietly in the spaces between conversations, in the pauses before answers, in the way eyes shifted when I entered a room. Nothing was said directly, yet everything felt uncertain. That was when I realized something painful. Rejection would have been easier. If Saad had told me, "Mom, we need space," I would have understood. If Sanaa had said, "I want to handle things on my own," I would have stepped back. But instead, they kept assuring me, "You're important. We respect you. You're always welcome." And yet, my role kept shrinking. I began questioning myself in ways I never had before. Was I too present, too emotional, too attached to how things used to be? I replayed memories from years ago, raising Saad, managing the house, being relied on. Back then, my involvement was called strength. My opinions were valued. My presence mattered. Now, the same qualities felt inconvenient. I didn't blame them entirely.
Times change.
Families change. Roles shift. I understood that. What I struggled with was the feeling that I was being misread in the process. One afternoon, I sat alone in the living room, folding laundry that wasn't mine. I realized I did this often now, keeping myself busy with small, unnecessary tasks. It gave me a sense of purpose, however fleeting. Sana walked past and smiled politely. "You don't have to do that, Mom." "I know," I said softly. "I just like staying useful." The word surprised me as they left my mouth. Useful. Had that become my measure of worth? Later that evening, Saad mentioned casually, "Sana thinks you push yourself too much. You should rest more."
Rest.
Another gentle word that carried an unspoken meaning.
Step back.
I nodded. She's right. And I did step back. From the laundry, from the kitchen, from decisions. But stepping back didn't bring relief. It brought silence. Days passed where no one asked for my help. Weeks where my opinion wasn't needed. Conversations flowed around me, not through me. And still, no one rejected me. They smiled. They checked in. They made sure I was comfortable. That was the cruelest part. I was being cared for but not included. I remembered a time long ago when a friend had stopped inviting me to gatherings. Eventually, she admitted she felt we had grown apart. It hurt, but it made sense. This didn't. Here I was still present, still part of the family, still loved, yet somehow unnecessary. I began to wonder if I had imagined my importance all along.
That thought terrified me.
Late one night, unable to sleep, I sat by the window and watched the streetlights flicker on. I thought about all the years I had been needed, not just wanted, but depended on. And now, being needed seemed almost like a burden. I asked myself a question I had avoided. If they don't need me, who am I now? That question echoed through me for days. I noticed how I started apologizing more, for things that didn't require apologies. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt." "Sorry, I was just thinking out loud." "Sorry, I'll move." Each apology felt like I was shrinking myself to fit into a space that no longer had room for me. One evening, Sana invited some friends over. I stayed in my room, giving them space. When Saad came to check on me, he looked relieved. "They're loud," he said kindly. "I didn't want it to bother you." I smiled. It doesn't. But I wondered, had my presence become something to manage? I wasn't rejected. I was accommodated. And somehow that felt worse. Because accommodation suggests tolerance, not belonging. The realization settled heavily in my chest. Rejection would have allowed me to grieve and move forward. This kept me suspended, still here but not fully part of anything. I started to withdraw emotionally, even when physically present. I stopped sharing stories, stopped volunteering memories, stopped offering opinions unless directly asked. Not out of resentment, but out of self-preservation. Each misunderstood moment chipped away at my confidence. I wondered if my voice had always sounded this heavy, if my presence had always been this complicated. And for the first time in my life, I doubted myself, not my love, but my right to express it. One afternoon, Saad noticed my quietness. "You've been distant lately," he said. I wanted to laugh. Distant? I was still here, every day. But I understood what he meant. "I'm just giving you space," I replied. He nodded, relieved. That relief hurt more than any rejection could have. Because it confirmed what I had feared. My absence was easier than my presence. That night, I admitted something to myself with painful clarity. I was tired of being understood wrong. Tired of correcting assumptions. Tired of proving that my intentions were gentle. I longed for the simplicity of being accepted or dismissed. Anything but this quiet erosion of self. Rejection would have been honest. This was slow disappearance. And I didn't yet know how to stop it. There was a time when I believed words could still fix things. If I chose them carefully enough, if I softened my tone just a little more, if I explained, not to defend myself, but to clarify my heart. So I kept talking. I explained why I asked questions, that I explained why I cared, that I explained why silence didn't mean anger, and concern didn't mean control. Each explanation felt reasonable, gentle, necessary. But with every attempt, I felt my voice grow weaker. Not because they argued, but because they agreed. They nodded. They reassured. They told me they understood. And yet, the misunderstandings stayed exactly where they were. It felt like speaking into a room where sound didn't echo back. One afternoon, I found myself explaining something I had already explained 3 times before. Halfway through my sentence, I stopped. My own voice sounded unfamiliar to me, strained, cautious, almost apologetic. I realized then how tired I was. Tired of translating myself. Tired of softening truths. Tired of explaining emotions that had once been accepted without question. I missed the days when I could speak without preparing for misinterpretation. I noticed how conversations began to exhaust me before they even started. I rehearsed in my mind, anticipating how my words might land, how they might be taken the wrong way. And sometimes I chose silence instead, not because I had nothing to say, but because I no longer had the energy to explain. Silence, at least, couldn't be misunderstood. Or so I thought. Because even my quietness began to carry meaning they assigned to it. "You seem upset," they'd say. "I'm fine," I replied. And that was the truth, but it wasn't believed. I realized something painful. Once people decide who you are, every word you speak becomes evidence. I could explain endlessly and still be seen through the same lens. That was when my voice began to retreat, not in anger, not in protest, but in self-protection. I spoke less, that I observed more. I saved my words for moments that truly mattered. And slowly, I stopped trying to be understood by those who had already decided what I meant. Not because I had given up on love, but because I was tired of hearing myself explain it. Didn't notice it at first. The shift was subtle, quiet enough to pass as concern. "You said you prefer things simple. You mentioned you don't like noise. You told us you get overwhelmed." They repeated my words back to me gently, almost kindly. But something about it felt wrong. My honesty, things I had shared to be understood, were now being used to define my limits for me. Conversations began to end before I could join them. "We didn't include you because you like your quiet," Saad explained once. I hadn't said that. I had said I didn't mind quiet. There was a difference. Another time, Sanaa made a decision without asking me, then added softly, "I knew you wouldn't want to be involved. You said you don't like stress." Again, half true, fully distorted. I didn't like unnecessary stress. I never said I didn't want to be included. That was when it became clear. My explanations had been simplified, reshaped, and quietly used to justify my exclusion. Understanding had turned into permission. Permission to decide for me. Permission to speak for me. Permission to step around me instead of toward me. And, because it came wrapped in care, I felt guilty for feeling hurt. After all, weren't they just respecting my boundaries? But those boundaries weren't real. They were interpretations. I began to recognize how dangerous partial understanding can be. Rejection says, "I choose something else." Misused understanding says, "I choose for you." One evening, I tried to correct it. "That's not what I meant," I said softly. "I still want to be part of things." Saad looked surprised. "We thought you preferred distance." The words landed heavily. I hadn't chosen distance. It had been assigned to me. I realized then how easily truth can be rewritten when people believe they already know you. I stopped correcting them. Not because I agreed, but because I understood something new. Once your words are used against you, silence becomes safer. So I watched. I listened. I learned how quickly good intentions can be turned into quiet justifications. And how being understood without empathy can hurt more deeply than being rejected ever could. I didn't decide to become silent all at once. It happened gradually, like lowering your voice without realizing the room has changed. At first, I paused before speaking, then I shortened my sentences. Eventually, I stopped offering thoughts unless I was directly asked. Not because I had nothing to say, but because silence felt safer than being misread. When I spoke, my words were reshaped. When I explained, my meaning was diluted. When I stayed quiet, at least my intentions remained my own. Silence protected me. It meant no clarifications, and justifications, and quiet rewrites of my truth. I began to observe instead. I noticed how decisions were made quickly now, confidently, without looking toward me. How conversations flowed easily when I wasn't expected to respond. How peace seemed easier to maintain when I stayed in the background. And I accepted it. Not with bitterness, but with resignation. There was a strange calm in being quiet. A release from the constant need to manage how I was perceived. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my mind or worried about how a sentence might land. I spoke when it mattered, that I listened when it didn't. And in that quiet, I learned something about myself. I didn't need to be understood to know who I was. I didn't need agreement to trust my intentions. My silence wasn't surrender. It was self-preservation. Saad noticed the change eventually. "You don't talk much anymore," he said one evening. I smiled. "There isn't much to say." He looked uncertain, as if searching for something beneath my words. But there was nothing hidden this time. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't waiting to be asked back in. I was simply at peace with saying less. Silence, I discovered, has its own honesty. It doesn't explain. It doesn't convince. It just exists. And for the first time in a long while, existing felt enough. It happened on an ordinary day. No argument, and confrontation, and dramatic moment that demanded a decision. I was sitting alone in the living room, the afternoon light falling softly across the floor, when the thought came to me with surprising clarity. I don't need to be understood anymore. The realization didn't feel heavy. It felt light. For so long, I had believed that being understood was a form of safety. That if people truly knew me, they wouldn't hurt me. That clarity would protect me. But clarity hadn't protected me. Understanding hadn't healed me. Instead, the need to be understood had kept me trapped, explaining, correcting, reshaping myself so others could feel comfortable. That day, I let go of the effort. Not in anger, not in defeat, but in acceptance. I stopped wanting my intentions to be validated, stopped needing my words to land correctly, stopped hoping someone would finally see me the way. After I stopped trying to be understood, something shifted inside me. I still love Saad and Sanaa deeply, but I no longer felt the need to manage how they saw me, and I no longer felt the weight of their interpretations pressing down on my chest. Love, I realized, could exist without explanation. I helped in the kitchen, guided where I could, smiled when I wanted, but I spoke only when necessary. That I offered advice quietly, not to teach, not to correct, but because I genuinely wished to help. If it was ignored, I let it go. If it was misunderstood, I let it go.
There was a strange peace in this.
No one needed to understand me perfectly for me to love them fully, and no one needed to validate my intentions for me to exist calmly in their presence, and no one needed to decode my words for me to know my heart was pure. Sanaa noticed it first. "You seem lighter," she said one evening, carrying plates from the kitchen. That I smiled. "I've stopped worrying about being understood." She blinked, confused. "But aren't we listening to you?" "Yes," I said softly. "But that's not the same as needing approval. I love you both, and that's enough." Saad nodded quietly, absorbing it. I saw the understanding dawn slowly in his eyes, the recognition that something fundamental had shifted. I no longer sought reassurance. I no longer tried to justify my presence. I existed fully in my own space, loving quietly, observing, and speaking only when it mattered. It was a love that didn't demand, a love that didn't bend to interpretation, a love that was steady, unshakable, and serene. And with it came a sense of dignity I hadn't felt in years. The hurt from being misread didn't vanish entirely, but it lost its power. I no longer felt fractured by misunderstanding. I had finally learned that love doesn't require constant explanation, that peace doesn't depend on validation, that being true to yourself is more important than being understood by everyone. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole again, still part of their lives, yet fully myself. It was quiet in the house that evening. The kind of quiet that carries years of small words, small moments, and unspoken truths. I sat in the living room, a warm cup of tea in my hands, watching the soft shadows dance across the walls. The sunlight had long faded, leaving only the muted glow of the lamp and the distant hum of the street beyond our window. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely still, not anxious, not weary, not waiting to be misread. Saad approached quietly, sitting on the edge of the couch across from me. There was hesitation in his eyes, something I hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that was rare in him, even as an adult I had raised. "Mom," he said softly, I think I've been wrong." I didn't respond immediately. I sipped my tea, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of years settle between us. He continued, "I think I finally understand, not everything, not perfectly, but enough. I see that sometimes we interpreted your care as control, that your silence felt like distance, that sometimes we hurt you without meaning to." I felt a lump in my throat. My hands trembled slightly around the cup. This acknowledgement, it was what I had silently longed for, yet I had never dared to expect. "I never wanted to hurt you," Saad said, his voice breaking slightly. "I know I wasn't careful, or maybe I thought I was. I see now how my words and actions may have caused you to shrink, to doubt yourself, to retreat." I put the cup down. My eyes met his. I could see the truth there, earnest and unpolished, raw in its own way. "You didn't hurt me because you wanted to," I said finally, my voice soft but firm. "You hurt me because you didn't realize, because you didn't fully understand. And that's human. That's life. I forgive that part of it. I forgive it because understanding isn't something you can force, and love doesn't depend on it." He nodded, a slow, relieved motion, almost as if he were learning to breathe again after holding his breath for too long. Sanaa joined us shortly after, carrying a small tray of snacks, her usual calm demeanor softened by a trace of emotion. She knelt beside me, placing the tray gently on the table. "Mom, I see now," she whispered. "I think I've finally realized how much you gave, how much you loved, and how misunderstood you were all this time." I reached for her hand. "Sanaa, you're part of this family and you're loved. But love doesn't have to come with perfect understanding. Sometimes being present, being willing to try, is enough." That's all I ever needed. Tears welled in her eyes, and she squeezed my hand. "We will try harder. We won't take you for granted anymore." I smiled faintly. The tears I felt in my own eyes were different this time, not of sorrow, but of release, of recognition, of quiet triumph, because in the end, I realized that my hurt wasn't because I was unloved. It wasn't because I was unimportant. It was because I had been seen through lenses that never quite fit me. I had been misread, yes, but never wrong. My intentions, my care, my love, they were still mine. They had always been mine. And now, finally, some of them were being truly noticed. I thought about all the explanations I had given, all the words that had failed to land. I thought about the hours spent pausing, adjusting, translating myself for others who didn't yet understand. And I realized that none of that time was wasted. It had taught me my own strength, my own dignity, my ability to exist fully, even when misunderstood. Saad and Sanaa sat beside me, close now, their presence gentle and sincere. I didn't need their understanding to feel complete anymore. But the fact that they sought it now, it was a gift. Not because I needed it, but because it was freely offered. I leaned back, letting the warmth of the room surround me. The pain of the past, the moments of quiet erosion, the nights of self-doubt, they all belonged to a chapter that had brought me here. To this calm, to this clarity, to this peace. I whispered softly to myself, almost as if sealing it into the walls of the house that had witnessed so much. I was misunderstood. I was hurt. I was careful with my heart. And I was still loved. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but genuinely. And that is enough. If you feel the story, subscribe it for more life reflections.